Chapter 11. Nehemiah, a man of commitment. Nehemiah 10, verse 1. Now those that sealed were Nehemiah the Tirshatha, the son of Hakaliah, and Zedekiah. Verse 28. And the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethinims, and all they that had separated themselves from the people of the lands unto the law of God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, every one having knowledge and having understanding. The covenant is made. In the final verse of the previous chapter, we are told that Nehemiah and the Jewish leaders drafted a written covenant with the Lord and then proceeded to sign it. Nehemiah 9:38. In this formal manner, the Jewish people were making a solemn vow to the Lord that they would strive to keep the commandments and ordinances that were written in His Word. Making commitments to the Lord ought to be a part of every believer's life. Many in our world today refuse to make spiritual commitments to the Lord in regard to things like church attendance, daily Bible reading and prayer, witnessing for Christ, and a myriad of other important aspects of the Christian life. They will often piously say that they do not believe in making commitments in life, for they are afraid they may not be able to keep them. However, many of these same individuals have made commitments to banks or to other institutions for things like home mortgages or financing on an automobile. They can commit to a spouse at the marriage altar, but for some reason they are fearful of making a commitment to the Lord at their prayer altar. What they are really saying is that they do make commitments when it comes to temporal things, but they are not willing to do the same when it comes to spiritual things. This ought not to be true of us as believers in Christ. We should be willing to give our all and be committed to the one who gave His all for us and who is eternally committed to those whom He has purchased with His blood. In 2 Timothy 1:12, the Apostle Paul says, "For I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that He is able to keep that which I have committed unto Him against that day." The names are recorded. In Nehemiah 10, 1-27, Nehemiah and 83 other Jewish leaders placed their seal upon the written covenant which they had drafted. This sealed their oath before the Lord in the sight of the congregation. Verse 28 tells us that many other Jews joined Nehemiah and the leaders in making the covenant with the Lord, although there was not enough room for them to make their seal on the document. Nehemiah 10:28. And the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethinims, and all they that had separated themselves from the people of the lands unto the law of God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, every one having knowledge and having understanding. The obligations are understood. Verse 28 tells us that those who entered into the oath or covenant with the Lord were individuals who had understanding. This was important, for a vow made to the Lord was not to be taken without much prayer and consideration or entered into lightly. Moses had taught the people previously, in Numbers 30 verse 2, "If a man vow a vow unto the Lord, or swear an oath to bind his soul with the bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth." In the vow that they made to the Lord in Nehemiah 9, the people were committed to follow His word and be obedient to the commandments at which their fathers had often stumbled. In verse 30, they vowed to God that they would not continue the practice of intermarriage with the heathen people around them. Exodus 30, 10-17. This was a practice that had led the previous generation into sin. In verse 31, they vowed to honor the Sabbath day by abstaining from work, trade, and commerce. Exodus 35:2. They also vowed to honor the seventh year, in which the Lord allowed the land to have its Sabbath rest. Deuteronomy 15, 1-11. In verses 32-33, the people committed to renew and keep the shekel of the sanctuary tax, which had been established in Exodus 30, 11-16, to help support the maintenance of the house of the Lord. This collection of a shekel from all those 20 years old and upward served as a reminder to God's people of the price He paid in setting them free from the bondage of Egypt. In verse 34, lots were taken among the priests, the Levites, and the people, in order to see who would be assigned to care for providing the wood needed to offer the burnt sacrifices in the daily temple ministration. This was an important task, for large amounts of wood were needed to ensure that the offerings that were brought to the temple could be properly offered to the Lord. Those selected for this service were assigned specific times during the year in which they would perform this service. In verses 35-37, the people vowed to honor the Lord with the first fruits of their substance. Exodus 34:26. Throughout the Scriptures, believers are taught to give God the first and best of all we possess. Proverbs 3:9 says, "Honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the firstfruits of all thine increase." With this in mind, it is no surprise that the Jews in Nehemiah's day were willing and eager to show their gratitude to the Lord by giving him back the very best of what he had given to them. In the final verses of chapter 9, the people completed their vow to the Lord by committing to be faithful in the giving of their tithes. The word tithe is taken from the Hebrew word masar, which simply means a tenth. These tithes were to be used for the maintenance of the Levites, Leviticus 27:30-34, and the priests who ministered unto the Lord in the temple, Numbers 18:25-32. In Deuteronomy 26:12-14, we are also told that the tithes were used to help provide for the poor and needy within the land of Israel. Sadly, when the Jews returned from their exile, the tithe had not been paid to God by his people as a whole for some time, and this caused many of the Levites to have to move away from Jerusalem because they could not be supported through the temple treasury. Thankfully, the spiritual revival that the people experienced under the leadership of Nehemiah and Ezra soon remedied this problem. For when we truly get right with God, and He has our heart, we will have no trouble in also giving to Him our treasure. Matthew 6:21. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Because the hearts of the people in Nehemiah 9 were right with God, it was not hard for them to be obedient in the giving of their tithes and in bringing additional offerings to the Lord that far exceeded the tenth that was required. In verse 39, we see that the people said they would not forsake the house of our God.